My name is Earl McKenna. For more than 50 years, the sea has been my world. The sting of salt spray is more familiar to me than a lover's kiss, and the groan of an old hull in a heavy swell is a language I understand better than most. I've seen sunrises that could make a preacher weep. Storms could make a devil pray. I've pulled a life from the gray depths, day after day, year after year, until my hands became maps of every rope I've ever pulled and every hook I've ever baited. But even the sea, in all her vastness, can start to feel like a small room when you've stared at the same horizon for a lifetime. The salt gets in your bones, in your blood. It preserves you, but it also pickles you. And I was starting to feel well and truly pickled. One morning, I woke up before the gulls started their racket. Smell of the low tide, a smell I once called home, just made me tired. I looked at my boat, the Pearl, bobbing there in the murky harbor light. She's a good boat, honest and strong, but that morning she looked like a tether, tying me to this endless cycle of water and wind. It was then that a memory surfaced, unbidden, like a piece of driftwood long for. It was a memory of my father. He wasn't a man of the sea, not like me. He was a man of the earth, of the mountain. He had a quietness about him that the ocean always scoured out of him. He smelled of pine needles and damp soil, not brine and diesel. That thought led me to an old sea chest tucked away in the attic, a chest that held his few belongings. Underneath a folded wool shirt that still faintly smelled of him, I found it. A map, not a nautical chart of depths and shoals, but a land map, hand-drawn on brittle, yellowed paper. It was a crude thing, spiderweb of creeks and contour lines leading deep into the heart of the Appalachian mountain. In the center, circled with faded red ink, was a small, unnamed body of water. I remembered him talking about it once, a long time ago, when I was just a boy more interested in tying knots than listening to old stories. He called it his place of quiet. He said things were different up there, older. Something in me snapped that morning. It wasn't a loud break, quiet, giving way like a mooring line in a gentle tide. I needed a different kind of water. I needed water without salt, water that didn't heave and sigh with the turning of the moon. I packed a small bag, left a note for my neighbor Ben to keep an eye on the Pearl, and pointed my old truck inland, away from the coast for the first time in what felt like a century. The air changed first. The thick, wet blanket of sea air thinned out, replaced by something clean and sharp. The endless flat horizon I knew so well began to buckle and rise, growing into green foothills and then into the blue-hazed shoulders of the mountains themselves. It was like sailing into a new world, a world of solid, unmoving waves. After 2 days of driving, following the creases in that old paper, I arrived at a small town nestled in a valley. It was the kind of place that seemed to be held together by rust and tradition. The last stop before the wilderness chewed up the paved road. I needed supplies, so I pulled up to a general store with sagging porch, screen door that slapped shut with a sound like a gunshot. Inside, it smelled of sawdust and cured tobacco. An old man with a face like a dried apple sat behind the counter, polishing a pair of spectacles. "Help you with something?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "Just need some lamp oil, some dried rations," I said, laying the items on the counter. My map was still in my hand, and he glanced down at it. His eyes, magnified by the thick lenses, lingered on the drawing. "That's an old path you're looking for," he said, not as a question. "Not many folks go up that way anymore. Not many folks ever did." "It was my father's," I explained. "He had a spot he liked up there." The old man nodded slowly, his gaze distant. He introduced himself as Gideon. He told me he'd run this store for 60 years, and his father before him. He knew these mountains like I knew the tide. He wrapped my supplies in brown paper, his movements slow and deliberate. "The mountains are old, friend," he said, his voice dropping a little. "Older than the stories we tell about them. The water up there, It's ancient, cold. Some of those high, lonesome lakes, they keep secret, and some secret, they don't like being fished. I must have given him a look, the kind of weary smile a man gives when he's heard 1,000 tall tales in 1,000 portside taverns. I've heard stories of mermaids, ghost ships, krakens that could pull a whaler to the bottom. A secret in a pond didn't seem too threatening. He saw my skepticism. "I'm not talking about monsters, mister," he said, pushing my supplies across the counter. "Some things are stranger than monsters. Just be respectful of the quiet, that's all." I thanked him, paid my bill, and left, the screen door slapping shut behind me. His words followed me out into the thin mountain air, clinging to me like the morning mist. I followed the map's final leg on foot, the path dissolving from a gravel track into a faint deer trail. The air grew cooler, thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The world became a cathedral of green and gray. The only sound, the whisper of wind through the hemlocks and the crunch of my boots. It was a profound and humbling, so different, the constant clamor of the... And then I saw it, just map promised, through a curtain of ancient rhododendron was the lake. It wasn't large, maybe a few acres across, but it felt immense. The water was the color of old pewter, perfectly still, reflecting the brooding gray sky like a flawless mirror. A thick white mist coiled and drifted across its surface, clinging to the water as if it were born from it. The trees crowded the edges, their dark forms silent and watchful. There was no bird song, no chirp of insect, just the deep, resonant silence Gideon had spoken of, a quiet, physical presence, a weight on the... It was the most beautiful and unsettling place I had ever seen. I set up a small camp, my movements feeling loud and clumsy in the stillness. I didn't really intend to fish. It felt wrong, somehow, a violation. But a fisherman without a line in the water is like a priest without a prayer book. It's a question of identity. So, out of a habit born from 50 years of routine, I rigged my old casting rod. I tied on a simple lure, a small silver spinner that mimicked a minnow. I walked to the edge of the water, the damp soil sucking at my boots. I drew the rod back, the familiar motion a comfort in this strange place, and with a flick of my wrist, I sent the lure sailing out into the center of the mist-shrouded lake. It landed with a soft plink that seemed to echo for an eternity. I began the slow, steady retrieve, the little blade of the lure churning just beneath the surface. I watched the line cut a V through the still water. It felt pointless, a fool's errand. And then it happened. It wasn't the frantic, jarring strike of a hungry bass or the stubborn pull of a snag. It was a sudden, immense weight, as if I had hooked the bedrock of the mountain itself. The line went taut, with a low thrum that vibrated up the rod and into my bones. My drag screamed for a second before I tightened it down. The rod bent into a deep, straining arc, the tip plunging toward the dark water. Whatever I had hooked wasn't fighting. It was just pulling. A slow, powerful, inexorable drag, drawing my line down into the cold, silent depth. In all my years on the ocean, wrestled with sharks, tuna, and things that had no business being on a line, I had never felt anything like it. It felt ancient. It felt the fight, we call it that, a battle of attrition. It was me against a dead weight, a silent, stubborn force that seemed to draw its strength from the very core of the mountain. My arms, accustomed to the grueling work of hauling nets and wrestling with ocean currents, began to ache with a deep, burning fatigue. The muscles in my back and shoulders screamed in protest. This was different from fighting a fish in the open sea. There's a give and take, a frantic dance of runs and turns. Here, there was only a slow downward pull, a relentless pressure that tested the limits of my tackle and my stamina. The minutes stretched into an eternity, marked only by the creak of my reel and the ragged sound of my own breathing in the profound silence. Twice I managed to gain a few feet of line, my reel groaning as I cranked the handle with all my might, only to lose it again as the unseen thing in the depths made another slow, powerful surge. It didn't thrash, panic. It just moved with an unnerving confidence, as if it were merely annoyed by my presence. The mist on the water seemed to thicken, swirling around me, isolating me on my small patch of shoreline. It felt as if the lake itself was holding its breath, watching. Gideon's words about secrets that didn't like to be fished echoed in my head, no longer sounding like folksy wisdom, but like a grim and literal warning. Finally, after what must have been the better part of an hour, I felt a subtle shift. The pressure lessened, not suddenly, but gradually. The downward pull gave way. I seized the opportunity, reeling furiously, my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. I wasn't just fighting a fish, and I was fighting the oppressive mystery of this place. I had to see what was on the end of my line. Slowly, painstakingly, I worked it towards the shore. A dark shape began to materialize, the pewter-colored water rising from the depths. It was large, much larger than I expected for a mountain lake. It moved sluggishly, its energy spent. I backed away from the water's edge, pulling the creature into the shallows. As its form broke the surface, my mind simply refused to process what my eyes were seeing. It was shaped like a trout, a big, beautiful brook trout, with a familiar speckled pattern along its flank. But that's where the familiarity ended. The creature was not covered in scale, not in the slightest. Its body, from the tip of its blunt nose to the broad fan of its tail, was covered in a thick, dense coat of fur. It was like the pelt of a mink or a river otter, a rich chocolate-brown fur that was slicked down and dark with water. Spots of brook trout were there, but they were markings in the fur itself. Dappled patch of lighter brown cream, with a few faint halos of a surreal pale blue. I stood there frozen, the rod dropping from my numb fingers. The air left my lungs in a silent whoosh. For a moment, I was convinced I finally lost my mind. That the solitude, the strange atmosphere of the lake, had caused my brain to simply invent this impossibility. The fish lay in the shallow water, its gills flaring rhythmically, its dark, placid eyes staring up at nothing. It wasn't a monster. It wasn't grotesque, horrifying. It was, in its own way, beautiful and utterly, completely scientific impossible. I knelt down, my old knees cracking in protest, and reached out a trembling hand. I hesitated just above its back, then forced myself to touch it. The sensation was surreal. It was soft, unmistakably fur. It felt warm, despite the coldness of the water, a living, breathing mammal that had the body of a fish. I ran my fingers along its side, the fur thick and water-repellent. My entire life, my entire understanding of the world was built on the fundamental laws of nature, laws I had observed every day on the ocean. Fish have scales, mammals have fur, birds have feathers. These are simple, immutable truths of my world. And here, in my hands, a creature that defied it all. The initial shock began to recede, replaced by a dizzying rush of thoughts. My first instinct, the instinct of a fisherman, was one of triumph. This was the discovery of a lifetime. This was more than a trophy. It was a new species, a biological miracle. I could be famous. My name, Earl McKenna, would be in textbook. Scientists would flock here. National Geographic would do a special. The thought was intoxicating, a powerful brew of ego and excitement. I could already picture the headlines, the interviews, the stunned faces of experts as I presented this impossible creature to the world. I built up the fire as dusk began to bleed into the sky, the last light painting the bottom of the cloud in shades of bruised purple and orange. I couldn't bring myself to kill the creature. I tethered it carefully, a long line, a shallow, protected pool by the shore, where it swam in slow, lazy circles, seemingly untroubled. I sat by the flames, the strange fish, dark shape, moving in the deeper shadow, and the weight of my discovery began to... It was a physical weight, heavier than any net I'd ever hauled. As the night deepened, the silence of the lake seemed to change. It was no longer just an absence of sound. It was a watch waiting. I stared into the flames, and the faces of other fishermen I'd known over the years seemed to flicker in the embers. Men who lived by a simple code of respect for their catch and for the water that gave it to them. What would they think? Then I thought of Gideon, the old stork. His warning about secret. He wasn't talking about a legend or a ghost story. He was talking about this. He knew. Or if he didn't know exactly what was in this lake, he knew that it contained something that should be left alone. The intoxicating vision of fame and recognition began to sour. I imagined the parade that would follow my announcement, the roads being carved into this pristine wilderness, the teams of scientists in white coats descending on this quiet sanctuary with their net, their probe, their specimen jar. I saw camera crews trampling the mossy banks, their bright lights scarring the sacred darkness. I saw this impossible, beautiful creature pinned to a board in a laboratory, its soft fur matted and dry, its life reduced to a scientific curiosity. And then I saw the rich collectors who would pay anything for a fur-bearing trout to mount on, the fishermen who would come not with respect, but with greed, tearing this quiet little world apart until every last one of its mysteries was dragged out in unforgiving light. The fire crackled, spitting a spark onto my boot. I looked from the flames to the dark, placid water. In the moonlight, I could see other shapes moving just beneath the surface. Furtive, graceful shadows gliding through the depth. There were more of them, an entire community of these impossible beings living their silent lives in this one forgotten corner of the world. I hadn't just caught a fish. I had stumbled upon a secret garden, a hidden chapter in the book of life that had somehow remained unread, and now I held the pen. I could either share it with the world, or I could close the book and walk away. The choice felt immense, a burden I was never meant to. My grand discovery was quickly becoming my secret. The night grew long and cold. I didn't sleep. I sat hunched by the dying embers of my fire, the old wool blanket wrapped around my shoulders, doing little to ward off the chill that had settled deep in my bones. It was a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. It was the cold weight of rebellion. Every so often, I'd hear a soft splash in the shallows, a gentle ripple in the dark, and I'd look over at the tethered fish. It was just a shadow among shadows, a living piece of the lake's deep mystery, and I was jailer. The moon climbed high, a sliver of bone-white hanging in the ink-black sky, and its pale light seemed to make the water even darker, even more inscrutable. My mind, usually so clear and focused on the practicality of tide and weather, turbulent sea of its own. I thought about my life, 50 years of chasing fish. What was it all for? For the money, sure. To put food on the table, to keep the pearl afloat. But there was more to it than that. There was the pride in a good catch, the satisfaction of reading the water, of knowing the habits of the creatures that lived beneath the waves. It was a life built on a kind of contract with nature I took, but I also respected. I understood my place. I was just a man in a small boat on a vast ocean. Humility is the first and last lesson the sea teaches you. And what was this? This urge to shout my discovery from the mountaintops? It felt like a betrayal of that lesson. It felt like arrogance. It was the same arrogance that led men to overfish the Great Banks until they were barren. The same pride that convinced them they could conquer the sea instead of living with it. I had spent my life watching men try to tame the wild, and I had seen the wild push back with devastating force. But this place wouldn't push back with a hurricane or a rogue wave. It would simply vanish. Its magic would be dissected, catalogued, and extinguished, leaving behind nothing but an empty lake and a footnote in a biology textbook. The secret wasn't a monster to be slain. It was a prayer to be left unanswered. As the first hint of dawn began to soften the eastern sky, painting the horizon in a wash of pale gray, my decision settled in my heart, quiet and solid as a stone anchor finding the seabed. There was no more turmoil. There was only a calm certainty. I knew what I had to do. I got up, my joints stiff and complaining, and walked over to the water's edge. The fur-bearing fish still there, swimming calmly at the end of its line. In the gentle morning light, I could see the intricate beauty of its coat, the way the tiny hairs caught the light, creating a soft, subtle halo around its body. It was perfect in its impossibility. I waded into the bracingly cold water, the shock of it making me gasp. I moved slowly, deliberately, not wanting to frighten it. I gathered the creature gently in my... It was surprisingly calm, its body solid and alive against my palm. It felt less like a fish and more like some gentle water spirit from an old tale. I looked into its dark, unblinking eye, and for a fleeting moment I felt a sense of connection, silent understanding passing between two of the world's solitary creatures. With my other hand, I carefully worked the small, barbless hook in the corner of its mouth. It came free easily. I held it for a moment longer, this living paradox. Then I lowered my hands and let it go. It lingered for a second, as if getting its bearings, and then with a powerful flick of its broad furred tail, it was gone. It didn't bolt in a panic. It simply swam away, melting back into the pewter depths of the lake, leaving nothing behind but a slowly expanding ring of ripple on the surface. I watched until the last ripple faded, until the water was once again a perfect, still mirror. A profound sense of relief washed over me, so potent it almost brought me to my knees. The weight was lifted. The secret was safe. It was no longer my discovery to share. It was my memory to protect. I returned to my camp and began to dismantle it with an almost reverential quiet. I scattered the ashes from my fire pit, buried my footprints, and made sure I left no sign that I had ever been there. I wanted the forest to swallow the memory of my intrusion, to leave this place as untouched as I had found it. Before I left, I took out my father's old map. I looked at the faded red circle he had drawn so long ago. I finally understood why he called it his place of quiet. It wasn't just about the absence of noise. It was about a place where the world's frantic need to know, to own, and to conquer simply exists. He hadn't sent me treasure. He'd sent me learn a struck him and held the flame to the corner of the brittle paper. It caught quickly, curling into a black ash, the lines and symbols of my journey vanishing into smoke. I held it until the heat singed my fingertips, then I let the last fragile piece fall. The mountain wind, whispering through the pine, caught the ashes, scattered them over the lake, returning my father's secret to the water that had kept for so long. I walked away without looking back. The journey down the mountain felt different. The silence was no longer unsettling. It was comforting. The world felt bigger, more mysterious, more wonderful than it had the day before. I got back in my old truck, and as I drove away, I caught a glimpse of Gideon's general store. He was on the porch, rocking in his chair. He saw my truck, and he raised a hand, not in a wave, but in a slow, simple gesture of acknowledgement. A small, knowing smile was on his face. He knew I had seen it, and he knew I had let it go. I returned to the coast, to the familiar sting of the salt and the cry of the gull. The Pearl was right where I left her, bobbing patient. When my neighbor Ben saw me, he asked if I'd had a good trip. Quiet, I said. It was real quiet. He asked if I caught anything. I just smiled. Nothing worth keeping, I told him. And in my heart, I knew it was the truest lie I'd ever told. Sometimes now, when I'm out on the open ocean, late at night, with only the stars for company, I think about that lake. I think about what's swimming in its cold, dark water. It's my secret now, a quiet place in my soul that the sea can't touch. I never became famous. My name will never be in any textbook, but I became something else. I became a guardian, a keeper of a story that will never be told. And I've come to realize that the greatest treasures are not the ones we pull from the depths and show to the world, but the ones we have the wisdom and the humility to leave right where we found them. True wisdom lies not in conquering or exposing nature's mysteries, but in having the humility and grace to protect them. The greatest discoveries are sometimes the ones we choose to keep secret. My name is Earl McKenna, and these are my stories from a life at sea and sometime beyond. Subscribe to my channel because the deepest waters hold the darkest secret, and I've still got plenty of tales to tell.